Retro video game collecting has seen a boom in recent years. Whether it's a byproduct of boredom from the COVID-19 lockdown, or the attention that was brought to the hobby by streamers and content creators alike, retro games have shot up in price and only seem to be getting more expensive. With this increase in popularity, we're seeing more collectors seeking out their favourite console's holy grail, the game that is the hardest to find, and usually costs the most. The Nintendo 64 has Clay Fighter's Sculptor's Cut, the SNES has Nintendo Power Fest 1994, but what about the PlayStation 2? The PS2 saw one of the largest quantity of titles made for any console, with over 4,000 individual games released over its 12-year run. Sitting on top of that massive pile is Rule of Rose. Rule of Rose is a psychological survivor horror game created by Japanese developers Punchline. At the time of writing this video, it's sitting at an average of $648 for a complete copy and $1,237 for a graded one. So why is Rule of Rose the most expensive PS2 game out there? Before we answer that, let's take a look at what the game is about. We play as protagonist Jennifer, a 19-year-old girl who finds herself trapped in the Rose Garden orphanage. The orphanage seems to be ruled by a group of kids who dub themselves the Red Crayon Aristocrat Club, a deranged social club that's used to establish a hierarchy among the children. The objective of the game is to survive by following the club's demands, all while unraveling what's going on at the orphanage. The game takes a lot of inspiration from the Brothers Grimm fairy tales in how it tells its story. Your progression in the game is annotated like a children's book, and the concept of the entire narrative is that you're filling in the blanks of an unfinished tale. Rule of Rose was met with mediocre reviews on its release, most often praising the story and atmospheric design, while citing frustrating gameplay and confusing level layouts. At this point, you might be asking, if the game was so average, why is it so sought after nowadays? Well, there's a few reasons as to why it's become a collectible marvel. The game had an extremely limited printing run in the West due to major controversies and issues with publishing. Initially, Sony Entertainment Japan came to Punchline and asked them to create a horror game for the PlayStation 2. Not wanting to settle for another Resident Evil clone, they went for a unique psychological horror storyline that tackled themes such as bullying, toxic friendships, and childhood trauma. This was fine for Sony Japan, who published the game with no issues in January of 2006. The problems came when the game tried to release in the West. Both Sony America and Sony Europe wanted nothing to do with Rule of Rose, claiming it didn't align with the company's image, even though it was Sony Japan who commissioned the game in the first place. While there was no overtly horrific scenes or intense gore, it was the fact that the game's edgy themes were centered around children that caused it to be seen as too grotesque for Western audiences. With Sony out of the picture, the publishing torch was passed to Atlus Games for the NTFS version and 505 Games for the PAL version. Atlus was no stranger to edgy themes after just releasing Persona 3, a game featuring schoolchildren using guns on themselves to summon their personas. 505 Games were honestly just publishing anything they could get their hands on at this point. Atlus managed to publish Rule of Rose in the US under an M for Mature rating in September of 2006. Soon after, 505 were gearing up to release the game across Europe, with the Pan-European Game Information or PEGI rating set as 16+. This meant you had to be 17 or older to buy the game in the United States, and 16 or older to buy the game in Europe. Unfortunately, before the European release, Rule of Rose reached mainstream media for all the wrong reasons. False and exaggerated rumours spread amongst news sites about the game's content, making outrageous claims such as the winner is whoever buries the most children alive. It soon became the topic of discussion amongst European politicians, most of it spearheaded by these two: Europe's Justice and Security Commissioner Franco Frattini and Mayor of Rome Walter Veltroni. Veltroni's main talking point was that a violent video game should not be sold in Italy, and Rule of Rose mustn't enter Italian homes. Frattini, on the other hand, was taking aim at a much wider issue. In a letter to Interior and Justice Ministers, Frattini noted he was shocked by the obscene cruelty and brutality in Rule of Rose. He called for a dialogue between both government and video game industry reps to discuss how games were being labelled and marketed towards children. See, 2006 was a strange time for video games. Even though the PEGI and ESRB rating systems were in place to show consumers what age groups the games were suitable for, video games were still very much seen as for children, regardless of their intended audiences. It didn't help that in the 2 years prior to Rule of Rose's release, we saw similar controversies cause outrage among mainstream media. There was the release of Manhunt, a game which involved you to sneak around and murder criminals in a brutal fashion, leading it to be banned in numerous countries. Bully, which was seen as encouraging children to misbehave and commit violent acts, leading to its name being changed in the UK and Ireland to Canis Canem Edit, and the hot coffee missions for GTA San Andreas, which involved courting and praying with women. While this bonus game mode didn't ship live in the final game, the code and animations were still in the game's files, so once modders managed to hack it back into the game, word spread around news sites fast. Even though a lot of the claims made by media and advocates were false, the anti-video game narrative was still fresh enough to make retailers pull Rule of Rose from their shelves and refuse to stock the game any longer. The UK even went as far as banning the game outright from release. Eventually, 505 Games pulled the plug on the Rule of Rose European release and left us with whatever copies managed to slip through the cracks. With an already limited release being cut short, and a widespread smear campaign making sure it was never restocked again, Rule of Rose went on to become the most expensive PS2 game. Outside of very specific collector items, of course. It now lives on as a cult classic of the horror genre. A story too cruel, too beautiful, to go untold. Thank you very much for watching. Be sure to subscribe if you enjoyed this video and want to see more from me. I'd also love to hear about your holy grail, whether it's a game, trading card, or any collectible. Hopefully it's a little less controversial than Rule of Rose was. See you soon.